Imagine being told the enemy flying toward you has no engine sound at all, no growl, no roar, no warning, just silence. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, 1943, a German airfield tucked behind the front line. Soldiers laugh around a fire. One of them jokes about the Soviet women flying toy planes made of wood and cloth. Cheap propaganda, he says. A publicity stunt from a desperate country. The men around him laugh harder. Above them, the sky is empty. Or so it looks. Then a shadow slides across the moonlight. No engine, no sound. Just the faint whisper of wind through wooden wings, gliding. Gliding. A deep hollow thump rips through the camp. Then another. Fire blooms across the tents. Men scramble half-dressed into the dark. Screaming orders no one can hear over the ringing in their ears. By the time anyone looks up, there's nothing there. The bomber is already gone, engine ticking back to life somewhere over the tree line, vanishing into the black. No one saw it. No one heard it coming. And by morning, the men who laughed the loudest wouldn't sleep again. This is the story of a unit almost rejected before it ever flew. Built from planes meant for farming, not war. Flown by women some generals refused to take seriously. And it became one of the most feared presences in the night sky of World War II. To understand why this unit had to exist, you need to understand how badly the Soviet Union was bleeding. By the autumn of 1941, German forces had smashed deep into Soviet territory. Entire divisions were being wiped off the map in weeks. Cities were falling. Millions of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe owned the skies, and Soviet aircraft factories couldn't produce planes fast enough to replace what was being shot down. Every able-bodied man was already being funneled into a meat grinder of a front line that stretched for 1,000 miles. Trains rolled east full of the wounded and rolled west full of boys who hadn't finished growing into their uniforms. There was no surplus. No reserve, no margin for error. And still, the war effort needed more. More pilots, more bombers, more pressure on the enemy, every single night, without pause. Picture the arithmetic on a Soviet general's desk. Every week, a new list of losses. Aircraft destroyed on the ground before they even took off, because the Luftwaffe controlled the skies so completely that airfields themselves had become targets. Fuel shortages. Factories relocated 1,000 miles east, still spinning up production while shells fell near the front. Nothing about this war was giving the Soviet Union time to recover. The Soviet High Command faced an impossible math problem. They needed combat units they didn't have the manpower to build. Standard doctrine said this was a job for men trained, veteran, battle-hardened men. But those men were already dying by the tens of thousands on the ground, and the ones who weren't dead were exhausted, stretched across a front line too long for the army left to hold it. Something had to give. That's when a message reached Joseph Stalin's desk. Not a request, a demand. From a woman most of the military establishment considered an inconvenience. Her name was Marina Raskova. Before the war, she'd already become a national hero, one of the first women to navigate long-distance Soviet flights, celebrated in newspapers, decorated by the state. But fame in peacetime doesn't buy respect in a war run by men who see aviation as a battlefield, not a headline. When Raskova pushed to create combat aviation regiments made up entirely of women, the reaction from much of the military brass was somewhere between amusement and irritation. Women in the cockpit of a bomber, flying combat missions against the Luftwaffe? To many senior officers, it wasn't just unconventional, it was a joke dressed up as a proposal. But Raskova had something the skeptics didn't count on: direct access to Stalin. And thousands of young women across the Soviet Union, desperate to fight for their country. Volunteers poured in from flying clubs, from universities, from factory floors, girls who had learned to fly in amateur aero clubs, never expecting it would prepare them for war. In October 1941, with the Germans still advancing and the need for combat units becoming desperate, Stalin authorized what the skeptics never thought would happen: 3 all-female aviation regiments. One of them would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They trained in a fraction of the time male pilots normally received. Compressed courses, long nights, freezing barracks, uniforms cut for men, hemmed and altered by hand because nothing came in their size. Every one of them was told, directly or indirectly, that they were an experiment, a distraction, a political statement more than a military asset. Then command handed them their aircraft. And that's when even the volunteers started to wonder if the mockery had a point. The plane was called the Polikarpov Po-2. It wasn't built for war, it was built for farming. A crop duster, a training aircraft for teenage flying club students. Wood frame fuselage. Fabric-covered wings. An open cockpit exposed directly to the freezing night air. Top speed barely over 90 miles an hour slower than some cars on a modern highway. It had no radio, no radar, no armor plating to protect the crew. For most of the war, it didn't even carry parachutes. If you were hit, there was no bailing out. There was just the ground, coming up fast. Picture handing a bicycle to soldiers and telling them it's now a tank. That's roughly how seriously the Luftwaffe took it, once they figured out what they were up against. The bomb load was pathetic by real bomber standards, a few hundred kilograms. Nothing close to what a proper Soviet or German bomber could carry. No defensive machine guns worth mentioning. No speed to outrun a fighter. No altitude to escape flak. By every rational measure of 1940s air combat, this plane should have been a death sentence for its crew within the first few missions. German pilots who spotted them in daylight didn't even consider it a real threat. Some treated intercepting a Po-2 as barely worth the fuel, but the women flying them had found something nobody had accounted for. The Po-2 was so slow, so light, so absurdly underpowered that it broke the entire logic of modern aerial combat. A German fighter plane, built for speed, had a minimum stall speed, a point where it flies too slow to stay in the air. The Po-2's maximum speed was often close to that fighter's minimum speed, which meant a Messerschmitt trying to line up a kill shot risked stalling and dropping out of the sky entirely if it slowed down enough to match the bomber's pace. The tiny plane was also almost invisible to early radar, too small, too slow, made of the wrong materials to register properly. It could skim just above treetop height, hugging terrain no bomber pilot in his right mind would risk. And then the crews discovered the trick that would turn this laughable little biplane into a nightmare. They could cut the engine, glide in silence, drop the bombs, restart, and vanish into the dark. Here's what a bombing run usually sounds like. A distant drone, growing louder. Engines. Warning. Time to run for cover. Here's what a Po-2 raid sounded like. Nothing. Then a faint rustle, like wind brushing through branches. Then the bombs. German soldiers began describing the sound of the approaching aircraft as a broomstick sweeping across the night sky. It's where the nickname came from, Nachthexen, night witches. That name wasn't official. It wasn't printed in any Soviet propaganda leaflet. It came from the enemy itself, men trying to describe something that terrified them and didn't fit their training. Because that's the deeper wound this weapon inflicted. It wasn't really about the bomb damage, though, that mattered. It was about what happened inside a soldier's mind on the 5th night without sleep, the 10th, the 30th. Anti-aircraft crews trained to track engine sound had nothing to track. Searchlight operators trained to catch a bomber in daylight bright beams found themselves scanning empty sky, only for the bombs to land somewhere behind them a heartbeat later. Soldiers started sleeping in shifts, terrified of the night itself. Rumors spread through German ranks faster than any official report could contain them, stories of witches, of women who could see in the dark, of planes that couldn't be shot down by normal means. That last rumor wasn't far from the truth. The Po-2's wood and fabric frame meant tracer rounds and shrapnel often passed straight through without triggering the kind of catastrophic damage that would down a metal-skinned aircraft. Planes came back from missions with dozens of holes in the fabric and kept flying. It said the German high command grew so frustrated with their inability to stop the raids that any pilot who managed to shoot down a night witch was automatically awarded the Iron Cross, not for destroying a strategic bomber. For beating an aircraft their own training manuals told them shouldn't even be a threat. Think about the message that sends down through the ranks. If killing this joke of a plane deserves your nation's highest honor, it was never really a joke at all. Anti-aircraft gunners started firing at shadows, at birds, at nothing. Searchlight crews burned through hours of fuel sweeping empty sky, jumping at every gust of wind through the trees. Soldiers who had marched through years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, men who had faced tanks, artillery, and mass infantry assaults without flinching, found themselves rattled by something they couldn't see, couldn't hear coming, and couldn't reliably shoot down even when they tried. That's the real weapon here, not the bomb load, the unraveling. An army trained to respond to threats, it could identify engine sound, radar blips, Visible aircraft was being worn down by an enemy that offered none of those signals until it was already too late. The regiment's method demanded precision most units couldn't sustain. Pilots and navigators flew multiple missions a night, sometimes 8, sometimes more, landing only long enough to ram and refuel before climbing back into the freezing open cockpit and doing it again. There were nights when the tactic worked with devastating success. Formations approaching key positions in near-total darkness, engines cut at the critical moment, bombs landing with pinpoint accuracy on supply depots and troop concentrations that had no idea death was already gliding overhead. Entire sectors of the front reported disrupted resupply lines and shattered morale after nights of repeated raids. But not every commander trusted the method. Not every mission went by the book. There were nights the regiment pushed for cover of full darkness, for the silent glide approach that had kept crews alive mission after mission, and were overruled. Ground commanders, impatient for results, sometimes demanded raids launch earlier, under conditions that stripped away the very advantage that made the tactic work. Engines running the whole approach. No glide. No silence. Those missions paid a different price. Aircraft caught in searchlights with engines roaring, no radio to coordinate an escape, no speed to outrun what was now hunting them properly. Crews who had survived a dozen silent raids were lost on the missions, where the plan was ignored for the sake of speed. The lesson was almost cruelly simple. The joke plane only worked because of discipline, patience, timing, silence. Every time arrogance or urgency stripped that discipline away. The cost was paid in the lives of women who had already proven, over and over, that they knew exactly what they were doing. By the war's end, the regiment had flown tens of thousands of combat sorties. Dozens of its pilots and navigators were awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor, a recognition that would have seemed unthinkable to the officers who once dismissed the entire idea as a stunt. The Po-2 was never redesigned into something sleeker, faster, more conventional. It never needed to be. The very things that made it a punchline, the wood, the fabric, the pathetic top speed, were exactly what made it untouchable in the hands of pilots who understood how to use them. Go back to that airfield. That fire. Those laughing soldiers, mocking a plane they hadn't yet learned to fear. Somewhere above them, engine already cut. A night witch is gliding closer in total silence, carrying forward everything those men refuse to believe, that the ones you underestimate are usually the ones who are already circling overhead. They called it a joke. By the end of the war, the joke was the reason an entire army was afraid to close its eyes.